Nobody wakes up and decides, that's it. From today, I'm going to stop feeling things. It's a much longer and slower process than that. So slow, you don't even notice the handovers happening. There's no single morning where you can point and just say, that's it. That's exactly the moment when it changed. It's more like a dimmer switch that someone's been turning down in the background for months, maybe years. And you only notice how dark the room's gotten when someone else mentions it. It's the small things you stop feeling first. A film that would have moved you last year does nothing this year. A song that used to move you deeply doesn't hit you the same way anymore. You've got the social script down to pat. You laugh at the right moments because you know that's where the laugh goes. You say the right things at the right time, but you've stopped feeling the lines. Then you stop feeling excited about the things you used to really look forward to. A holiday abroad, a weekend away. Even good news doesn't register much. You notice yourself just going through the motions of being pleased rather than the emotions of actually being pleased. And weirdly, the bad stuff doesn't register much either. Something that should really wind you up. Something that would sucker punch you out of blue or genuinely upset you. You take the hit without even wincing. And then you just carry on business as usual. And it's not until later you notice you never actually reacted at all. Not just processed it quickly, you never reacted at all. What catches most people out is they mistake this for being fine. Numb gets relabeled as calm. Flat gets rebranded as not one to overreact. Unbothered becomes a compliment people give you. And then you start to believe it's a strength rather than what is actually happening to you. You start telling people you're not really a big feelings person, like it's some sort of personality trait, when 6 months ago it wasn't. Nobody in your life questions it, because from the outside, it looks like maturity, composure, the guy who doesn't lose his head. Nobody sees what actually it costs, because the cost doesn't show up anywhere visible. It shows up as absence. Maybe you've tried to fix this in the obvious ways. A better bedtime schedule. Maybe you thought you just needed a good night's sleep, that you were running on empty and you just needed to recharge the batteries. But 8 hours doesn't do much when exhaustion isn't about tiredness. That's why you wake up after a full night's sleep and you still feel as flat as the day before. Sleep fixes fatigue, but it's never going to fix a system that's deliberately turned down the volume. Maybe you've tried a new gym routine, replacing the doom scrolling for early runs on the treadmill, even cutting down on the booze. And it probably helped for all of about 4 days. You felt a flicker of something, but then you're right back where you started, and you keep on telling yourself you'll get into a routine of things. But it's been 4 months now, and the only difference you're seeing is the money going from your account each month. This isn't about adopting better habits, and no amount of routine engineering touches something that isn't happening at the routine level. Maybe you've told yourself it'll just pass. It's just a bit of a rough patch. Something that's going to sort itself out once things calm down at work or at home. But time on its own doesn't fix this, because nothing about the underlying pattern has actually changed while you waited. Time just lets you get more practiced at noticing it, much better at performing being fine. Not less numb, just better at hiding that you are. And no doubt you've tried thinking your way out of it. You've spun around it in the early hours of the morning, analysing it from every angle, trying to find some logical solution into feeling something again. Analysing every single timeline, looking for the parts where the cracks started to show. But unfortunately, you can't think your way out of a pattern that isn't happening at the thinking level. This isn't a problem that logic can solve, and it never was. Your conscious mind isn't running this, and that's exactly why solo thinking can never find a way out. You can be the smartest man in the room and still not outthink something that was never installed by logic in the first place. So if it's not willpower, it's not time and it's not thinking harder, then what's actually going on? Your sneaky subconscious did this on purpose, never to hurt you. It was to protect you. Somewhere along the line, feeling things at full volume got too loud, emotionally. Maybe it was grief that never got the right space to move through. Maybe it was disappointment stacked on disappointment until reacting stopped being worth the energy it cost. Maybe it was simply too much for too long, with no room to process any of it properly. Work, home, role, responsibility, all of it landing at once with nowhere to put it down. But whatever it was, your subconscious made a call that somewhere underneath your awareness, if feeling this much costs this much, we're going to turn the volume down permanently, if that's what it takes to keep you functioning. And that's not weakness, that's the nervous system doing exactly what it's built to do, protecting you from something it decided at the time was too costly to keep feeling in full. The problem is, it doesn't know how to turn it back up once the danger's passed. It's still running threat assessment from last year, maybe even a lot longer than that. It's still standing guard at the door that nothing's trying to get through anymore, still preparing itself for a blow that isn't coming, all at the cost of everything else that you'd actually like to feel. This is why the fix was never going to be more effort, more sleep, or more time. Those all operate on the surface. They can support the process, but they can't touch what's actually running it. What's actually running it sits underneath, outside the conscious mind, running quietly on autopilot, deciding in the background what you're allowed to feel and how much of it gets through the filter. You already know the pattern. You know the behavior that's keeping you stuck. But what's hidden is why your subconscious is still running it. There's a payoff hidden underneath the numbness. Your subconscious created it to keep you safe. It did its job. It did what it had to do at the time to keep you protected. It's now though, and now is an outdated program. It's no longer needed. It doesn't serve you anymore. And it's keeping you stuck. But it can find a better way to protect you. One that doesn't cost you your ability to feel anything. You are not broken, and you're not a big feelings person. You're a person whose system did its job so well it forgot to stand out. If that's you, if numb has quietly become your normal and you've started calling it fine, then that's exactly the kind of pattern I work with.